Good afternoon and welcome to the class of 1997, 25th reunion panel. Woo! Thank you so much for coming out. I see lots of fellow 97ers here. This is fantastic. Yeah, it's a friendly crowd. It's been an absolute privilege to work with these panelists and with Kate as well in organizing this panel. And in thinking about the topic, we haven't had a reunion at Williams for the last 2 years due to the pandemic, and how important it is to connect here at Reunion and throughout our lives in general in a deep and meaningful way. And we had the privilege of all connecting a few times in preparation for this panel. It's been absolutely fantastic. So I think you're really going to enjoy today's panel on creating connections during times of disconnection. So just to briefly introduce our panelists, our first panelist is Walter Cheng. Walter is a hospitalist at Stanford for the Palo Alto Medical Foundation and also medical director of Skyline College. Our next panelist is the Reverend Sumi Loundon Kim. Sumi is the Buddhist Chaplain at Yale University and founder of Mindful Families of Durham in North Carolina. Our next panelist is Bahia Ramos. Bahia is Director of Arts for the Wallace Foundation. And our final panelist and the moderator for today is Sommers. And Sam is the professor and chair of the Department of Psychology at Tufts University. Thank you so much.
Thank you. First, thanks to Kate and Kirsten for putting all this together. It's a little unfair because the four of us have sort of been having a reunion now for 6 months off and on Zoom calls. So it's been really nice to get to catch up and renew acquaintances and get to know one another. And we're really excited to be here to share this with you. And I feel honored and privileged to be sort of moderating and steering the ship a little while we get to hear from our classmates and experts in different fields about their perspectives on these issues. We're going to be talking about connection during a time of disconnect. This is let's go with unique time to be having this conversation in our society, right? We are here at the first in-person reunion at our alma mater in quite some time. We're in the midst, in the throes still of a global pandemic. We are here this weekend, a weekend where across the country there are marches and protests and a movement in response to yet another tragic loss of life due to guns and violence in this country. We are here during a time where the last several years have seen a really sobering and distressing spike in racialized violence and hate speech and racial hatred and division. We're here in the midst of a climate emergency, and we're here the day after our Congress has started hearings on past and present threats to our democracy in this country. How's that for a time in our lives to find ourselves? This is, when you said to inject a little humor, this is working, right, so far? Okay. And so here we are, the four of us, and our goal is to talk a little bit about these challenges of connecting during a time like this. It is something that I think you're going to hear from a diverse set of professional and personal experiences here on this topic. I can tell you that in the last couple of years at Tufts University, where I'm a professor, I and one of my colleagues have started teaching a course on the science of coping, and specifically a focus on the science of coping with the COVID crisis. And we talk about a variety of topics in that class: the effects of sleep and exercise and nutrition on the immune system, misinformation in the psychology of conspiracy theories, how stress affects the body and what we can do to try to ameliorate some of those effects. But we spend a lot of our time talking about social connection and how important that is. And behavioral scientists, psychologists refer to social connection as something that we actually have a need for. And it may not be as fundamental a need as, say, food and water and shelter, but it's pretty close, according to many psychological and other behavioral science studies. And in teaching this class, one thing you learn is that when scientists talk about social connection, they mean more than one thing. There are a bunch of boxes we have to check to feel fulfilled along those lines, but we do need people with whom we have sort of empathic connection and emotional support. That is an important part of social connection, and maybe it's what comes to mind for you first. But we also need regular social interactions with other people, even if they're fairly neutral in their valence or direction. One of the things I think a lot of people recognize that they were missing during the times of quarantine and lockdown and isolation were sitting with friends at work and debriefing over the ridiculous meeting that could have been an email that just happened, or the people you run into when you're out walking your dog or waiting in line to get your morning coffee and so forth. And so there are a lot of different ways in which connection happens, and we're going to talk about some of those here. One thing that you'll see on the screen behind us, in front of you, is a Padlet link, and you certainly at this point, if you would like to, you can get out a smartphone or other internet-equipped device and start to enter that URL, because at the end of our session, we're going to have some time for all of you in person to connect with at least one other person in the audience here, but also through this website to connect virtually with all of our fellow alumni who are here for this weekend. And so if you'd like to begin the process of pulling that up, you can. What will happen is you'll see a little plus sign and you'll be prompted to enter your own thoughts. And those might be some of the challenges you yourself experienced during these times of challenge and isolation. It could be ways in which you connected and managed to find a way to connect with others during these times. It could be well wishes for the community at large. Any of those work, and then you'll be able to see them after this session is over for the rest of the weekend. But without any further ado, I want us to hear from my classmates who are here on the stage with me. And so the first question I'm going to ask, and I'm going to pass it to you, Walter, first. I'm going to ask you the following question, Walter, to tell us a little bit about on sort of the challenge side of things. In the couple of years, we're now past 2 years into this pandemic, what are some of the challenges that you've seen with regard to disconnect and lack of connection in these times of disconnect, things that you've seen or experienced yourself?
Sure. Well, it's so exciting to see everyone here, and I think this ability for us to reconnect today and reconnect this weekend is just so meaningful, I think, to me and to all of us. So thanks for coming. I think I was going to speak a little bit about sort of my professional background and some of the observations I've made as a physician, and particularly as a hospital-based physician during this pandemic. I think two things that I've noticed that's been really difficult for me professionally is that as a physician, I wasn't aware until the pandemic hit how important physical touch was as a physician, and especially for people who were going through an illness for which we knew very little about in the first 6 months to a year, and to realize there were people who were sick and scared who might be dying, and for me to have to take care of them through, God knows how many layers I had to put on, and to realize that touching someone with a pair of gloves and seeing them through a fogged up mask and face shield was just a very, very poor substitute for the human touch that I had become used to as a physician. I think that was very jarring for me for a while, and still to this day, because obviously for our COVID patients, we still have to do that, and it's very hard to minister to them and hard to counsel them. I mean, that was very hard. I think the second thing that was very jarring for me professionally in terms of this disconnect that I felt, I'm sure there are other physicians in the room and other healthcare providers, but I remember in the first few months of the pandemic, at 7 p.m. in San Francisco where I live, people would get out and start banging pots and pans to celebrate the healthcare workers. I was very moved by that, and I thought that as the pandemic moved along, these conspiracies and suspicions of the healthcare profession and of public health officials started to really emerge. And more I started to see patients who, had taken these very conspiratorial stances on healthcare, yet were getting very ill, and this constant disconnect that I felt about, them viewing me suspiciously and with almost a sort of a hate towards me, but at the same time they were also quite ill, kind of demanding care, and trying to emotionally reconcile that, and trying to, again, provide empathetic and compassionate care was a big challenge, and I think emotionally very draining for me. And I think probably many healthcare providers who are in the audience have felt that as well. So, that's an ongoing, I think, struggle, right? And I think personally, it was hard. I think all of us felt separated from our loved ones. I didn't see my parents. I actually just saw my parents for the very first time last week because they expatriated to Taiwan, and as a non-Taiwanese citizen, I was barred from entering the country. So, not being able to commune with those loved ones was very, very difficult.
For sure. Bahia, same question.
Hi, sorry. I think when the world is burning, we turn to arts and culture as a mode of connection and think about how it builds connective tissue between us and serves to kind of like articulate the human condition. And when the pandemic happened, kind of that world was ripped away from us. And I think everything went dark. And there was this like physical darkness and then the kind of emotional and social darkness, and the danger of coming together to do anything just didn't allow for that connection and that inspiration to try to heal us from this thing looming that we didn't know about. And I think, so culturally, just sitting in the city where Broadway goes dark, where artists aren't allowed, like don't have a physical realm to share their work or talk about their work, where there are not spaces for us to come together because we don't know what might happen, really took an emotional toll on our sense of culture and it's the power of belonging. And it was really profound, I think, for me to experience that as someone who participates and invests in the arts, trying to reconnect with artists. And then also, I think there was pressure put upon artists to tell us, help us understand what's going on, do something, say something that helps us kind of interpret and understand. And that pressure also weighed on artists as well, to have to produce when they are going through their own social, economic, kind of racial ramifications, right? If we can't even talk about what arts institutions were going through at the time with their own racial reckonings around representation, and to have this all happen at once, this confluence of events, really kind of tore the heart out, so to speak. And I think for me, personally, I went dark. As someone who really participates and loves and thrives in culture, I asked myself this question as everything was shutting down: what could I do to fortify myself in the space of all this darkness, in the face of all this darkness? And it went back, I mean, it's gonna sound corny, but it went back to my heart. It went back to who am I? What am I? Where's my voice? How am I represented? How am I present for myself and for other people as in the middle of all this darkness, the sounds of sirens in my neighborhood are whirring around me. So it was really, really hard. And I think there was a pull back and the sense that disconnect was the only way to survive.
Yeah, Sumi, your thoughts?
Thank you for that. Wow. Wow, it's a pleasure to be here. So in the first few weeks of the lockdown, as the kids came home, I found myself disconnecting from the worldly concerns, getting kids off to school on time and getting to work and all the errands that one does. And as we settled into a quieter, slower pace at home, I found myself reconnecting with my interior world. And in retrospect, this pathway from disconnecting from worldly concerns to a turn inwards to spiritual practice was a very familiar and even comfortable pivot to make, because for those of you who have ever gone on a retreat before, this is exactly the same thing we have to do to prepare for, say, 7 days of meditation or contemplation. We have to wrap up a whole bunch of loose ends, put a vacation message on the inbox, and as we drive to the retreat center, leave behind everything in the exterior so that we can make room for the interior. So for me, this transition was not that hard, and also somewhat welcome. And quite a few of the people I knew who had contemplative backgrounds in any tradition likewise experienced the same thing. I was also quite pleased to see that the training in mindfulness had given me skills to self-regulate, to work with strong emotions, and that the training had kind of become like a boat that let me float on choppy and rising waters of distress and change. And other people I know who had some kind of contemplative background had said the same thing. Contrary-wise, with the Yale students that I did pastoral counseling with, and sometimes faculty, staff, and others, and even a few Williams students, for those who didn't have some kind of faith tradition either in their past or in their current world, generally people found the severance from their routines, the loss of their social circles, the opportunity to go out, found that very stressful, of course. And the time that they had alone very quickly shifted into feelings of loneliness, considerable restlessness, and even to places of despair. And so I watched as people went into some very funky psychological places within maybe the first half year. So that was my experience with Disconnect.
I think what strikes me in listening to what all of you have to say is how, yes, we walk very different lives professionally, but we're dealing with such similar themes as they manifest themselves in different ways. And they're obviously the level of severity, the idea, Walter, of treating patients who at the same time need you to save them, but also at some level resent the imputed politics they've decided to go. I mean, it's hard for me to wrap my head around that, to be honest. And you said dissonance, and yeah, I would imagine. And I think about sort of my professional experience on a campus like this one, and the idea of learning sort of firsthand just how much, and I know here at Williams, the wrestling with this was going on as well. I mean, just how much of our college experience, our experience with all of these people who we see out here who are so familiar to us now, how much of that familiarity and that experience was sitting in the TV common room watching a sitcom yelling at the screen together, right? Or comments made during lecture maybe when they shouldn't have been, back and forth, or 3 a.m. at wherever it was, ordering whatever food was still available at that point in time, and how hard that is when that's not there, right? And you can do Zoom classes, but you can't do that stuff on Zoom. So having talked about the challenges, let's talk about what we did to strike out and try to reestablish connection and to connect in these times of disconnect. Walter, I think we're going to start with you again on sort of the positive side of the ledger and things that you either were able to do or now maybe aspire to do moving forward, having gone through this experience to maintain connection. We are now 2 years removed from those first days you talked about, but everything that's going on in the world is certainly still a lot of challenges. What do you take from that, and what have you done?
Well, what's interesting I found is for years in healthcare, we were told that telemedicine, or the idea to use video cameras, was completely forbidden. Medicare wouldn't pay for it. There was no way that this was ever be possible. And what is it, in 2 weeks, into the pandemic, all of a sudden video visits became completely acceptable, and it's become the norm of care. But I've actually found that to be incredibly useful if used in the right setting. As a hospital-based physician, usually the only points of contact I would have with patients and their families would be the single or one or two people who'd come to the hospital. But actually with the ability to do telehealth, I get to see entire family structures. And I think that's actually been incredibly useful for me to understand where my patients come from, who their support networks are, that I could never have gotten before the pandemic and before we had these this ability to use video connection. So I think that's actually been kind of a weird sort of godsend, I suppose, I have to say what's interesting, just as a side comment, is I think that in my field, maybe in contrast to what Sumi and Bahia and Sam you've mentioned, is that rather than things shutting down, my life actually accelerated, and I think only now are things starting to normalize a little bit, where I can actually take a little bit of a breath, And I think one of the biggest challenges, and I think I'm still working through this, is that, as Sumi was alluding to, this desire to look inward and to be mindful of oneself was something that I found very difficult to do in the first parts of the pandemic, because we were kind of working through a period of panic and just not knowing what to expect. So I think that the idea of being internally mindful was just so in the back burner, but I think it's so useful to see and to have talked to you over the last few months and trying to incorporate some of your thoughts into how I'd like to sort of move forward now that I can finally take a little bit of a breath. But I think I think healthcare is still struggling with figuring out how to navigate this new world. I think we're seeing a lot of consequences to COVID, not just COVID itself, but the consequences and the downstream effects on other disease processes. And how do we build a cohesive healthcare system now in this new environment is, I think, is still a big challenge. I don't have the best comments on this per se, because it's a little work in progress.
No, very, very understandably so. I think we're going to go to Sumi next this time. So Sumi, during, as someone who works and spends your day and your thought process devoted to specific types of connections you've been talking about, how have you sort of maintained that, changed the way that plays out in your, professional but also personal life during this time?
Okay. Walter, I do have to admit, I'm picturing you like meditating in the middle of the ER. And just like everything's around him and he's just so zen. Well, I'm going to share a little bit personally. So in the quieter routine, having been able to let go of so much for a period of time during the lockdown phase, I took the opportunity to do some much forestalled healing work on pretty significant childhood trauma. And I was extraordinarily fortunate to be directed toward resources around neuroplasticity and somatic experiencing, polyvagal theory, and internal family systems, and so on, and really learned some new methods for working with trauma, which now informs my work significantly. But as I was able to create a much safer place in my body, I found myself moving from the chatty headspace that does all the planning and so on, just down into the heart space and into the body. And as I came into the heart space, of course, with the Buddhist background, we have training in self-compassion, and we know self-compassion is key. And I had some self-compassion. But this went into a place that was very tender, very warm, and like a kind of a true self-compassion. And I was really stunned to see just how deep self-compassion could go. And as that warmth for myself and the cherishing for myself unfolded, I noticed that I was much warmer and open to other people, including strangers, that there was this availability and curiosity that hadn't been there. There's more defenses before. And so I saw that I was having a much more authentic connection with other people. Likewise, with the people that I was working with and just, other people I knew, after they got through that freak out phase of like, I'm alone with myself, good Lord, and restlessness and how much Netflix can I watch, after that kind of subsided, I did that too, then I saw that they were able, in the stillness and quiet of their lives, to also start connecting with themselves. And that with their own, connecting with their own humanity, they were able to come back into connection with family members, with nature, and with other people. And as we came out of the lockdown phase, fall of 2021 at Yale, I noticed it was just so palpable, the joy that people had for being with each other in an undefended and fairly intimate way. It was very beautiful to witness. So it was almost like coming out of retreat, for those of you who've done retreat before. So I think that when I take this bird's eye view of what's happened, that we have seen kind of a profound spiritual realignment for many people. And I suspect that the way people have reconnected with themselves and their lives and with others around them over these last 2 years will have very important implications for how we proceed with healing racism, with dissolving forms of oppression, with healing our relationship to our earth. We might not be able to quite see this. Maybe it'll take 10 or 20 years. We can look back. But I have a feeling we've gone through something very, very significant spiritually.
Yeah, +1 to neuroplasticity. More on that. But I think, so the arts, the sector went through a huge tech boom, right? And everyone said, well, the solution to all of this is just to go online. And like, let's just funnel all our catalogs and all our stuff to the web, and that'll solve all of our audience and participation issues. And it kind of fell flat, and it kind of didn't work, and it had some jump starts. The places where you found the most joy were the things that we all, that I actually love now, but like, we all went to Instagram to DJ D-Nice's like late night sets, or I took many of Debbie Allen's Wednesday afternoon dance classes to just try to do something, to just try to connect. And you saw kind of the audience numbers go up and say, okay, I'm doing something with somebody. And institutions primarily had to rethink what their role is in community. And it wasn't just about the preservation of art. We saw museums become food banks. We saw them giving out art kits to kids. We saw them being comfort stations for protesters in neighborhoods. And they really had to rethink their role and what they meant to people. And I think within my work, we started to think about, what do people want from culture? And a lot of our work in the first year was around building a body of research around what do people of color want from arts and culture? What do people in general want from arts and culture? And what it came down to was a sense of welcoming and belonging. And how could arts institutions transform themselves or make themselves more welcoming, and not just through superficial kind of like displays of representation, but actually forming really authentic connections with their audiences and their desired audiences. As for neuroplasticity, for me, it was like, whoa, why am I bracing myself for everything? And like, where is that coming from? And what is triggering this? And can I rewire my brain to like have a different response to all of these things? And so I went into a period of just like carving new lines. And it was, like you, I had someone working with me, and it was really intense and interesting, but really thinking about redefining a story, and in the midst of this, what the role of pleasure might be in my life. I took pleasure in many things, but what did it really mean to have rest and pleasure and be strong and not do and not strive? And coming together with others who said, you know what, we just have to stop, and we'll start in a small circle and comfort each other and rest with each other, and then branch out a little bit more. And when those physical spaces opened up again, and I began to walk into a gallery. It started with a gallery, start small, and then into a museum, and finally maybe a theatrical production. But the sense of like connection you get from someone when you both show up for a show is like, hey, you like this too? Like, it's good to see you, thank you. And like, thank you, artists, for putting your life on the line to be here for all of us. And I feel so much more gratitude towards that art, like towards that act, and as if like the cultural connection is starting to form and be more present and more really represent the now, instead of like falling back on older systems, and really trying to be like actually grounded in reality and represent our interests and try to understand and build some authenticity into what they put on.
Yeah, that's great. Those are all, listening to three of you, it's all, I could do this for a long time. It's really interesting, and thinking through my own context as, well, I know we have other people in the room who are educators too. To me, one of the things that sort of dawned on me during this whole process was I started to feel like I had a different job than the one that I thought I had, because I would look around and I have these 18, 19-year-old students whose parents have sent them off somewhere to go to be college students and to get the experience that all of us had, and it's not there in the same way for them. And maybe some of it is the pandemic. I will admit probably some of it is having children of my own age who are getting to be to that point and thinking about, oh gosh, I'm gonna do that with my kid too. But just the idea that and I know this sounds crazy, but that just to be a human being, and that like being, it wasn't about being a teacher or a professor or a educator, like the human aspect of things, which you would think would be part and parcel of what you do as an educator, as a physicist, as a physician, I should say, as an artist, as a spiritualist, right? But just the reminder that, I found myself doing things like, well, on Zoom, you can use your slides as a background, and you sort of look like Al Roker doing the weather, and I can match my shirts to the slides, and I can wave at everyone from the side of the screen, and we're gonna have a musical introduction to each of these topics. We're talking about self-esteem today. Well, we're gonna play in with Lizzo and play out with Lizzo, and I'm gonna be in front of her in the background. That'll be great. And I'm gonna send emails to my name is Professor Sommers, and it's nice to meet you on Zoom. Send me a clip of your favorite 1980s YouTube song, and I'll send you one back. And I thought like 2 of them would, and like out of the class of 250, like 190 of them send me. So I started a lot of copying and pasting of Come On Eileen. It was going out to a lot of people, and move it over to Take On Me once in a while. But it was a different sort of, the expectation, it just felt different. It felt like a different kind of job that we were suddenly doing. Which brings me to something that I think sometimes some of the best questions in a discussion like this are ones that we didn't talk about ahead of time. You should see Walter's face right now. He's very excited about this. But no, just thinking about this, and everyone can pass, or these won't be particularly polished thoughts because we didn't talk about this ahead of time, but here we are talking about the shared experience we've all had in the last 2 years. Now, don't get me wrong, Walter, your experience was very different than mine, and we all had very different experiences. But we have another shared experience, right, which is what we're here celebrating sort of 25 to 29 years after the fact. And I guess as we're sitting here in this room and on this campus and looking at these folks, it's amazing. Also, I'm like, oh my gosh, I know exactly who that is, and it's been 30 years still, kind of thing. As we sit in this environment, I guess I wonder whether you have any thoughts about what that shared experience did in terms of either preparing us or making us think about the last couple of years and how we navigate them more generally. I mean, we went to school in a very sort of specific little beautiful Purple Valley bubble, and it was an experience. We all had different experiences within that environment, and I guess I wonder if being back here now, talking about what's gone on in the last 2 years, if the other context that we share, the decades earlier context, anything that comes to mind for anyone from our Williams experience that, if not help prepare you, because I know it helped prepare all of us for the jobs that we do, but that manifests itself in the way that we've tried to connect in these past couple times. And I don't have anyone to call on because I don't want to throw anyone to the bus, but I don't know, does anyone have thoughts on that? Sumi, you got thoughts on that?
Stab at that. I hope there aren't too many younger people here, because what I'm remembering is that, so I have teenagers, is that we are the cusp generation where, first of all, we didn't have smartphones. So we did do email, but mostly we talked to each other face to face. And we did that in that critical brain developmental period into adulthood, especially for the males, 18 to 22 or 24. Y'all know you're a little behind. But anyway, so I feel like, we benefited, and also the older classes benefited from real face-to-face community in ways we couldn't have anticipated, like how things would change. And I feel less certain that my children's generation, and also while I work with Yale students, of course they have a lot of face-to-face, but they also have a lot of, cell phone to cell phone. Like they're next to each other on their cell phones. So I'm not really sure, like in terms of nervous system co-regulation, like how that works. So that's what I would say was kind of special and helped. Who could have known 25 years ago that communal in-person experience would make us hardier for what was to come in the last 2 years?
Yeah, the technological aspect is really interesting. I know in our previous conversations, I know, Walter, you've mentioned sort of you did again, like getting to know patients' families and people having to use technology. I think about what it would have been like in 1996 if the pandemic, we wouldn't have seen most of these people. We would have, and so it's this fascinating double-edged sword. We would have been smoke signals and telegrams to each other, whatever we did to stay in touch. I guess phone calls, but just email maybe, but yeah. I don't know if other folks, and again, no one has to have thoughts on this because I just threw us under the bus with this.
I will say, maybe this doesn't deal with the pandemic itself, but just thinking about coming back here to Williams, in my profession, I find that probably 80 or 90% of my colleagues went to large universities. And I think in medicine in particular, in these large institutions, you tend to get very tracked very fast. And so all of my colleagues who went to UC Berkeley or UVA, I'm just picking up random colleges, they were tracked. And so 90% of their classes were in the hard sciences. And I see this lack of ability to communicate, this lack of empathy that can sometimes occur in my field, which is ironic because I think that in medicine is only partly a scientific field. So much of medicine is about empathy and communication, skill sets that I think you learn very, very well in an environment like Williams, where we have a small community. We're forced to interface face-to-face. We don't go to large classrooms where we're anonymous. We're forced to, in a very good way, to actually get out of our comfort zone, to study things outside of our, I always tell people, I started off as a music major here and then ended up going to history and then to psychology and somehow ended up with a biology degree with a concentration in neuroscience. How that all happened, I have no idea. And how I finished in 4 years, I still don't know how that happened. But I think that in the end, it gave me such a skill set to be empathetic and be communicative that I don't see sometimes. I'm being overly critical of my colleagues, but but I think the mindset of most pre-medical students is to study the sciences, do really well in the MCATs, and go to medical school and learn science. But that's actually not my field. And I think that Williams very clearly taught that early on. And I think through this pandemic, I think it's actually made me weather this period of time better, because I think that patients needed empathy during this process. Everyone was under stress. We were all frazzled. And I think that having learned these communication skills here was invaluable. And I hope it continues to this day, right?
Yeah, I'd say along with that, just kind of the navigational tools to get through these moments. Where is it okay to go left? Yeah, it's okay to go left. Let me just try what's on the left and then kind of swing over here. And I think for my experience at Williams, it was about that kind of how do I navigate my way through this terrain in a way that helps me get closer to who I feel I am, and that there was space to try to do that and I don't think I came out of Williams a fully actualized, I don't think I'm a fully actualized self at all right now, but I think that I tried, I dabbled, I went over here, I went over there, and there was nothing that said, there are boundaries around here. You cannot do this. You must not do this. You cannot do this. And so I think coming back, people say, "Oh, you went, you," and I'm like, "Yeah, girl, I did." And it is about I learned how to navigate. I learned how to shapeshift and experiment, and there was room and there was some safety around that for me in this experience. And coming back and walking into mission and feeling okay, help me remember that, tap into that and understand that about myself as a strength, not as something that tried to kind of push me down.
Yeah, and I think you also, just walking back onto this campus, you realize you can't sort of put a premium, you can't put a price tag on the idea of just sitting down with three people who it's not like the four of us were walking around as a group of four. We were in college, right? And so we spend this, and just be able to throw a question out there that we did not talk about ahead of time and hear really interesting things from people who are smart and accomplished and kind and able. That's something you take for granted when you're here.
Yeah. And I don't want to underestimate the beauty and wonder of this place as well. And to have been isolated, understanding that everyone in their communities use their parks, their outdoor kind of spaces to find connection, to understand their bodies, to just move and feel fresh air, to be in such a beautiful and wonderful place actually was a privilege, and to have this experience really, and to be able to call this, have a sense of home here is a really special thing.
So what we're hoping to do now is share this session with you in a more explicit way, which is we would like you to find someone in the room here. It could be, if you'd like, someone who you're seated right next to. Now, I know given the percentages at Williams, for half of you, that's probably your spouse that you went to school with here as well. So it does not have to be. You are free to get up and walk around and find another spot to sit, but someone who perhaps you don't live with, to share with them and have a bit of a conversation about some of the issues that we've been discussing. Maybe it's someone that you know a little bit and haven't really had that kind of conversation with before, which I feel like applies to the four of us and the time we've gotten to spend together, or someone who you don't know at all. But what we'd like you to do is to think about the questions that we just addressed. And it could be some of the challenges with regard to connection that you've experienced over the past 2.5 years, or it could be ways in which you have been able to strike out and maintain or adapt to the kinds of connections that you form with folks during a time of disconnect. And we'd like to give you a couple of minutes to have this conversation together. And then if anyone is interested in sharing with the group at large sort of success stories for how they've been able to really connect during a time of disconnect, we may have time for that as well. But one thing that we also want to remind you about is the website up here. So if you have not yet gone to this website, when you do, if you're able to do so and you hit the plus sign, you'll be able to enter any thoughts you have along those lines or anything that we've been talking about to the Padlet, such that when we end today, we'll be able to put them up on the screen for everyone, but you'll be able to go back and look at them throughout the weekend as well. So that is your assignment over the next, let's call it, 5-ish minutes. Find someone in this room and make a connection with them and share with them some of the challenge you've been through and sort of success that you've had trying to navigate that over the last 2.5 years. Go ahead, that's your assignment. Back there, Nate, I think we're ready for you to switch over the slide behind us so people can see the Padlet responses as they come in. Awesome. So behind us here on stage, you'll see as people respond to the question that was posed there on the phone app on the Padlet. You'll see some of the responses as they're coming in. If you'd still like to send your response, you certainly can do so. Having had a little time to connect, to reconnect, to make new connections here, anyone have any issues that came up during their conversation that they're willing to share with the group at large? Sumi and Walter have bravely decided to play talk show hosts and will walk the aisles. But is anyone willing to share any aspect of the conversation that they had with their newfound friends regarding, again, challenges during this time of disconnect, ways that they've tried to seek out connection? If anyone is willing to share with a hand, that would be great. I think maybe Sumi back there too. Walter, go for it. Yeah.
All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Paloma Marin Navarez, class of 2012. And I met with Kara Wick, class of 97. It's cool to make new friends. All right. 97 pride. And so I am currently a resident physician in Fresno. Yes, so it was a very, very isolating time from many different reasons. And so I brought my knitting stuff and we connected over crafts. So in the depression and the awfulness and the despair, I made a friend in residency who taught me how to knit. And so that's just the way in which I connected with like myself, and I got to confront a lot of my, fears about it's fears about making a scarf. Okay, girl. And so Kara shared that she also started sewing and was learning to sew with her daughter. And I like that as a way of, even though it's like one thing that you do on your own, you can also share with other people. And so that was really fun. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi. I am not anyone who studied here. I'm literally the spouse of someone from the class of 2012. So exactly what we're not supposed to do, we talk to each other. I just wanted to share something which is not so much about like success or how I connected with people or anything, but just like some thoughts that I had. I am not from the United States, so I don't really, if what I say doesn't apply, then it applies to a German context, I guess. But what I think about a lot is like the privilege that all of these conversations hold with respect to, on one hand, who's able to have these conversations, but then also who's able to think about these things. So when you think about like mindfulness or taking the time to certain things, there's just a lot of people, I think, who are not able to do this, and keeping in mind that like the issue of connection and disconnection is something that has existed before the pandemic for many people is, I think, very relevant. And there are like multiple things brought up for example, this whole like racism aspect of people facing racism, but at the same time having to help people or assist people or teach people that are racist is something that has been the reality for many people for like ever. And I think it's important to maybe look at this whole issue of pandemic and disconnection as something that is teaching us about the realities of people before that time, and kind of like seeing what we can take out of it with respect to these aspects. When I think about Black people who are teachers, for example, medical staff, and so on and so forth, that is something that's very real. And the same idea of like isolation, medical isolation, also is nothing that's new, right? So there's people who have been isolated before, who have had these experiences before. When we think about nursing homes, like, not to say that that is a forced medical isolation, but it is a form of isolation with respect to like healthcare that we literally didn't care before. But now that we're like, oh, this could be me, it all of a sudden becomes like relevant. So I think it's kind of important to keep in mind that this has been affecting people forever in different ways.
Thank you, and well said. Thank you. Other thoughts? Anything that folks would like to share? Yes, in the middle there, Sumi.
My name is Alex Sinclair, class of 97. One of the things to piggyback on that is that, there were a lot of stories of people that when things shut down, they didn't have their football team to go play on, and there were a lot of incidences of depression and suicide and things like that. And what struck me about it, thinking about myself and the way I interact with people, is that if those things were already there, like he was saying, the water went down and we saw a bunch of stumps and rocks. They were there, and they were visible then. And then when the water comes back up, we got to remember that those stumps are still there. It's not over. For people that have issues, and a lot more people have issues than anybody thinks. And if somebody, because they can't play football, has thoughts of suicide, that's a big problem. And football starting again doesn't make that problem go away.
Thank you. Yeah. We have time for at least one more, if anyone else has thoughts that came up in their conversations that they're willing to share with the group at large here. Anyone? I think in the back, Sumi.
I'm Bob Jackson, class of 62. Quite a bit older than anybody else here, probably. And I'm so pleased to see the qualities of Williams having blossomed since I was here. It was an all-male school. It was a white school. It was a preppy school. And yet there was a sense of intimacy, and I think it has really just moved me tremendously today to see how the good things about Williams are still there, and how it's just blossomed in so many beautiful ways. Let us hope that we continue to have this contact one-to-one, that we touch people, and that we can show our love for each other's humanity. Thank you.
That feels to me like a closing point. And that was wonderful and lovely, and thank you. And I think from all four of us who've been on this panel, from Walter and Bahia and Sumi and from myself, we again want to thank Kirsten and Kate for putting this together and being our fearless leaders with us. And want to thank all of you for your generosity on a beautiful day, for spending a little bit of time inside and listening to four alumni talk about their thoughts and experiences on these fronts. You couldn't pick, I don't think, a more apt topic for this session. Here we are. It's a reunion, and it's the first one in a couple of years. And so we hope that this is getting you sort of thinking even more so about connection than you would otherwise. And we hope maybe you can replicate what we just did here in this room as you go out onto this campus. I know if I do look back with one regret about my time on this campus, it was maybe too much time spent in a comfort zone and with people who were familiar. And so this is an opportunity at some level, only a couple days, but to rectify some of that and to reach out and to talk and make some connections with folks that maybe you didn't get the chance to do 25, 30 years ago. I know for the four of us, it's been a really fun opportunity to do that. We hope that you get that experience as well. And we just want to thank you for your attention and for being here.